There is a place where two continents reach toward one another across a narrow ribbon of water, where the currents of the Black Sea meet the calmer tides of the Mediterranean, where East and West have collided and merged for thousands of years. This is the story of that place, the city that would bear many names and witness the rise and fall of empires, the city that emperors and sultans alike would call the center of the world. To understand how it became the most coveted prize in human history, we must travel back to an age before the Great Walls, before the Golden Domes, before the name Constantinople ever graced human lips. In the 8th century, before the Common Era, the Greek world was restless. The city-states of the Aegean had grown crowded, their rocky soil insufficient to feed expanding populations, their young men hungry for land and opportunity that the homeland could no longer provide. And so began the great age of colonization, when Greek sailors ventured beyond the familiar waters of their ancestors to plant new cities on distant shores. They sailed westward to Sicily and southern Italy, northward to the coasts of Thrace and the shores of the Black Sea. Wherever they found favorable harbors and fertile land, they established settlements that would carry Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek customs to the farthest reaches of the known world. Among these colonizing cities, Megara held a prominent place. Situated on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, Megara had grown wealthy through trade and seamanship. Her sailors knew the treacherous currents of the Hellespont and the Bosphorus, that winding strait connecting the Propontis to the vast and mysterious Euxine Sea that the Greeks would come to, called the Black Sea. The waters beyond those straits promised tremendous wealth, for the shores of the Black Sea yielded grain in abundance, timber for shipbuilding, and the precious metals that Greek craftsmen transformed into objects of beauty. The legend tells us that a man named Byzas led a band of Megarian colonists in search of a new home. Before departing, as was the custom of all Greeks undertaking great ventures, Byzas consulted the oracle at Delphi. Kethia, that mysterious priestess through whom Apollo spoke, delivered her prophecy in a riddling manner typical of the god. Kethi to found his city opposite the land of the blind. The colonists pondered this cryptic instruction as they sailed through the Aegean, passed through the Hellespont, and entered the Sea of Marmara. They examined every promontory and inlet, searching for the meaning hidden in the oracle's words. When they reached the Bosphorus, that narrow channel where Europe and Asia nearly touch, the answer revealed itself. On the Asian shore, earlier colonists from Megara had founded a settlement called Chalcedon some 17 years before. Byzas looked across the water and saw what the founders of Chalcedon had inexplicably missed. On the European side, a triangular promontory jutted out into the waters, bounded on the south by the Sea of Marmara, on the east by the Bosphorus itself, and on the north by a magnificent natural harbor, a long inlet that curved inward like a golden horn. The founders of Chalcedon had chosen an exposed coastline with no natural harbor, while ignoring this perfect gift of geography directly across the strait. Surely, Byzas realized, they must have been blind. The advantages of this promontory were almost beyond reckoning. The Golden Horn provided the finest natural harbor in the entire region, deep enough for the largest vessels, sheltered from storms, and easily defensible. The currents of the Bosphorus swept fish in such abundance past this point that the waters themselves seemed to boil with life during the spawning runs, and a man could practically scoop his dinner from the sea with his bare hands. The hills of the promontory provided natural defenses, requiring walls only on the landward side where the peninsula connected to the Thracian mainland. And most importantly, is anyone who controlled this point controlled all traffic between the Mediterranean world and the Black Sea. Byzas established his colony around 657 before the Common Era, and he gave it his own name. Byzantium entered history as a small trading post, one among hundreds of Greek colonies scattered across the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. For centuries, it would remain a minor player in the great dramas of the ancient world, prosperous enough to survive, but never powerful enough to shape the destiny of nations. Yet, its position ensured that it could never be ignored entirely. For any power seeking to dominate the eastern Mediterranean or access the wealth of the Black Sea had to reckon with the city on the Bosphorus. The early centuries of Byzantium's existence passed in the shadow of greater powers. The city participated in the great upheavals that shaped the Greek world, sometimes as actor, more often as spectator. When the Persian Empire under Darius and later Xerxes launched their invasions of Greece, Byzantium found itself caught between the hammer and the anvil. The Persians swept through Thrace and demanded submission from the Greek cities in their path. Byzantium, like many others, bent before the storm, providing ships in tribute to the great king. After the miraculous Greek victories at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea turned back the Persian tide, Athenians led a campaign to liberate the Greek cities that had fallen under Persian control. The Athenian general Pausanias captured Byzantium in 478 before the Common Era, expelling the Persian garrison and bringing the city into the orbit of the Delian League, that alliance of Greek states that Athens would gradually transform into an empire of her own. For a time, Byzantium became a crucial link in the Athenian supply chain, where the grain ships sailing from the Black Sea passed directly beneath her walls. Athens depended on this imported grain to feed her teeming population. And so, the control of Byzantium and the Straits became a matter of existential importance to the greatest city of classical Greece. During the long struggle of the Peloponnesian War, Byzantium changed hands more than once. Spartans recognized that strangling Athens meant cutting off her grain supply, so the Straits became a theater of naval warfare and strategic intrigue. Alcibiades, that brilliant and treacherous Athenian commander, recaptured Byzantium for Athens in 408. The victory proved fleeting, for within a few years, Athens herself had fallen. Her fleet destroyed, her empire dissolved, her population starving behind the walls that Spartan forces encircled. The 4th century brought new masters to the Greek world. Philip II of Macedon, building the military machine that his son Alexander would wield to conquer an empire, recognized the importance of controlling the approaches to the Black Sea. In 340, Philip besieged Byzantium, bringing his formidable army and his innovative siege techniques against the walls of the city. The Byzantines resisted with desperate courage, aided by reinforcements from Athens and other Greek states who feared Macedonian domination. According to legend, the city was saved by a miracle. On a dark night, when Philip attempted a surprise assault, the clouds parted suddenly to reveal a crescent moon that illuminated the Macedonian troops and warned the defenders of the attack. In gratitude, the Byzantines adopted the crescent moon as their symbol, a device that would persist through all the transformations that lay ahead. Philip withdrew without taking the city, one of the few failures in his remarkable career of conquest. His son Alexander would pass through the region on his way to destroy the Persian Empire, but Byzantium itself remained on the margins of his great adventure. The city endured through the wars of Alexander's successors, maintaining her independence by careful diplomacy and timely submission to whichever Hellenistic king happened to be strongest at the moment. The centuries of Greek independence gave way slowly to a new reality as a power rose in the West that would eventually swallow all the lands around the Mediterranean. Rome expanded eastward with inexorable momentum, absorbing first the Greek cities of Italy and Sicily, then Macedon and Greece itself, and finally the wealthy kingdoms that Alexander's generals had carved from his empire. Byzantium retained nominal independence as a Roman ally. But true freedom was an illusion in a world increasingly dominated by Roman legions. The city prospered under the Roman peace, her merchants growing wealthy from the trade that flowed through the straits. The population swelled, and Byzantium took on the character of a cosmopolitan trading center where Greeks, Thracians, Persians, and Romans mingled in the markets and taverns. Temples rose to the gods of Greece and the divine emperors of Rome. The Greek language remained dominant. but Latin could be heard in the streets as Roman soldiers and administrators took up residence. Yet, Byzantium's very success made her vulnerable when civil war once again tore through the Roman world. King 193 of the Common Era, the Emperor Pertinax, fell to assassins, and rival generals raised their legions against one another in a bloody scramble for the purple. Septimius Severus, commander of the legions on the Danube frontier, eventually emerged victorious, but on his road to power he encountered stubborn resistance from Byzantium. The city had backed his rival, Pescennius Niger, and when Niger fell, Byzantium refused to yield. Severus besieged the city for 3 long years, and the inhabitants endured every horror that siege warfare could inflict. When the walls finally fell in 196, Severus showed no mercy. He demolished the fortifications, stripped the city of her privileges, and executed the leading citizens who had orchestrated the resistance. The ancient city of Byzas was reduced to a village, a mere appendage of the neighboring city of Tia. It seemed that Byzantium might fade from history entirely, remembered only as a cautionary tale of resistance to Roman power. But Severus was too practical a man to ignore geography forever. Even as he punished the city, he recognized that this location was simply too valuable to abandon. Within a few years, he began to rebuild what he had destroyed. New walls rose, grander than before. A great hippodrome took shape, where chariot races would entertain the populace. Bathhouses and temples proclaimed that Byzantium had regained imperial favor. The city that Severus had nearly erased from existence began to stir once more, though no one could have imagined what it would become. For another century and more, Byzantium remained a prosperous but unremarkable provincial city. Her Greek inhabitants living their lives beneath Roman rule, her merchants growing rich from the trade that flowed perpetually through the straits. The great events of the empire happened elsewhere, in Rome and Alexandria, on the Rhine and the Euphrates. Yet forces were already in motion that would transform this ancient colony into something the world had never seen. The empire was changing, groaning under pressures that would eventually fracture it beyond repair. And soon an emperor would arise who saw in Byzantium not just a trading post, but a destiny. The city's true story, the story that would echo through 1,000 years and more, was about to begin. The 3rd century of the Common Era brought chaos to the Roman world. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, murdered by their own soldiers, slain in battle against rivals, cut down by plague and misfortune. The frontiers buckled under pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and a resurgent Persian empire in the east. Economic collapse hollowed out the great cities, and the silver currency that had once bound the empire together became so debased that merchants refused to accept it. Historians would later call this the crisis of the 3rd century. And for a time, it seemed that the Roman state itself might dissolve into a patchwork of warring kingdoms. Order was restored, painfully and incompletely, by a series of soldier emperors who clawed the empire back from the brink of dissolution. Diocletian, who seized power in 284, recognized that the empire had grown too vast for any single man to govern. He divided responsibility among 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each controlling a portion of the Roman world. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, was meant to ensure orderly succession and effective administration. It also acknowledged a fundamental geographic reality that had been apparent for centuries. The Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East were drifting apart, bound together by tradition and administration, but increasingly distinct in culture and outlook. Diocletian chose to rule from the east, establishing his capital at Nicomedia, a city on the Asian shore of the Sea of Marmara, not far from ancient Byzantium. His choice reflected where power and wealth now resided. The eastern provinces had weathered the crisis better than the west, their cities still prosperous, their populations still dense, their agriculture still productive. The eastern frontier with Persia demanded constant attention, and an emperor who wished to confront that threat could not rule effectively from distant Rome. The Eternal City retained her prestige, her senate, and her monuments, but the practical center of gravity had shifted decisively eastward. The Tetrarchy functioned tolerably well, while Diocletian's iron will enforced cooperation among his colleagues. When he voluntarily retired in 305, the first Roman emperor ever to do so, the system began to fracture. The orderly succession that Diocletian had envisioned gave way to the familiar pattern of civil war as ambitious men reached for supreme power. Among those who entered this deadly competition was a young officer named Constantine, son of the Caesar Constantius Chlorus, who ruled the western provinces of Britain, Gaul, and Spain. Constantine's father died at York in 306, and the legions of Britain immediately proclaimed Constantine as his successor. This violated the rules of the Tetrarchy, which made no provision for hereditary succession. But the soldiers cared nothing for constitutional niceties. They wanted a leader they knew and trusted, and Constantine had grown up among them, sharing their hardships and winning their loyalty. What followed was 2 decades of intermittent warfare, as Constantine fought his way to sole rule over the Roman world, defeating rival after rival until only he remained. The decisive moment came in 312, when Constantine marched on Rome to confront Maxentius, who controlled Italy and Africa. According to the accounts that would later circulate, Constantine received a vision on the eve of battle. Some said he saw a cross of light in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Others reported that Christ himself appeared to Constantine in a dream, commanding him to mark his soldiers' shields with a sacred symbol. Whatever actually occurred, Constantine ordered his men to paint the Chi, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine's forces shattered the army of Maxentius, hooked, drowned in the Tiber while fleeing the rout. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God, and from that day forward he extended imperial favor to a religion that previous emperors had persecuted. The Edict of Milan in 313 granted tolerance to Christians throughout the empire, and Constantine himself, though he delayed baptism until his deathbed, increasingly aligned himself with the new faith. Churches rose where temples had stood, bishops gained influence at court, and the cross began its transformation from a symbol of shameful execution to an emblem of divine triumph. The empire that had crucified Christ was becoming a Christian realm, a transformation that Constantine both reflected and accelerated. By 324, Constantine had eliminated his last rival, Licinius, and stood as sole ruler of the Roman world. He was master of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Nile, but he faced the same problem that had confronted Diocletian. The empire needed an eastern capital, a city that could serve as an effective base for defending the Persian frontier and governing the wealthy eastern provinces. Nicomedia had served well enough, but Constantine dreamed of something grander. He wanted a city that would bear his name and reflect his glory, a new foundation that would rival Rome herself. Constantine considered several locations before settling on his choice. He reportedly began construction at the ancient site of Troy, sacred in memory as the origin of Aeneas, legendary ancestor of the Romans. But Troy was too remote from the major routes of trade and communication, and the project was abandoned. His attention turned instead to a site that offered everything an imperial capital required, Byzantium. The ancient Greek colony that Septimius Severus had demolished and rebuilt more than a century before. The advantages that had impressed Byzas still held true. The triangular promontory commanded the strait between Europe and Asia. The Golden Horn provided an unmatched harbor. The surrounding waters yielded food in abundance, and unlike Rome, with her centuries of accumulated tradition and her powerful senatorial families, Byzantium was a blank slate on which Constantine could inscribe his vision without obstruction. Here, he would build a new Rome, a Christian Rome, a city that would embody the transformed empire he was creating. In 324, Constantine personally traced the boundaries of his new capital, walking the circuit of the future walls with spear in hand, marking a perimeter that vastly exceeded the limits of the old Greek city. When his attendants expressed amazement at the scale of his vision, Constantine reportedly answered that he would continue walking until the invisible guide who walked before him chose to stop. The ceremony combined Roman ritual with Christian symbolism, a fitting inauguration for a city that would blend both traditions. Construction proceeded with extraordinary speed and expense. Constantine commandeered resources from across the empire, stripping ancient cities of their artistic treasures to adorn his new capital. Statues and columns, obelisks and bronzes flowed toward the Bosphorus from Athens and Rome, from Delphi and Alexandria. The serpent column from Delphi, crafted from Persian weapons captured at the Battle of Plataea 8 centuries before, was transported to grace the new Hippodrome. Porphyry columns and marble facades rose along new avenues that radiated from the central forum. Constantine designed his city to replicate the essential institutions of Rome. The new capital would have its own senate, drawn from the leading families of the eastern provinces and supplemented by Romans who could be persuaded to relocate. It would have its own populace entitled to free grain distributions, the famous bread dole that kept the urban masses fed and quiescent. It would have its own hippodrome adjacent to the imperial palace, where chariot races would entertain the people and the emperor could appear before his subjects in carefully staged ceremonies. It would have its own forums and basilicas, its own baths and cisterns, its own warehouses and markets. But Constantine's city would differ from old Rome in one crucial respect. From its foundation, it would be a Christian city. No pagan temples would rise within its walls, though the classical statuary that adorned the public spaces retained its old religious associations. Its churches multiplied across the growing metropolis, and Constantine himself funded the construction of several major basilicas. The Church of the Holy Apostles, where Constantine intended to be buried, rose on the fourth hill of the city, designed to house relics of all 12 apostles, with the emperor's own sarcophagus at the center. Constantine apparently saw himself as the 13th apostle, equal in dignity to those who had known Christ in the flesh. The formal dedication of the new capital took place on May 11th, 330. Constantine named his creation Nova Roma, the New Rome, though it would be known to later generations simply as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The dedication ceremonies lasted 40 days, combining pagan and Christian elements in a manner that later ages would find troubling. But that seemed natural enough to contemporaries still adjusting to the religious revolution underway. A gilded statue of Constantine crowned a great porphyry column in the central forum, the emperor depicted with the radiant crown traditionally associated with the sun god, a solar nimbus that Christians could reinterpret as a halo. The population of the new city grew with astonishing speed as Constantine used every inducement to attract settlers. He offered land and houses to Roman senators willing to relocate, built mansions at public expense for the new aristocracy, and extended the grain dole to feed the swelling population. Merchants recognized the advantages of the location and flocked to the wharves of the Golden Horn. Within a few decades, Constantinople had grown from a modest provincial town into one of the largest cities in the empire, a population approaching that of Rome herself. Constantine did not live to see the full flowering of his creation. He died in 337, finally accepting baptism on his deathbed, was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles as he had planned. His successors would quarrel over his inheritance, dividing and reuniting the empire in a wearying cycle of civil conflict. But Constantinople endured, growing in size and splendor with each passing decade. Her walls expanding to encompass new neighborhoods, her churches multiplying, her role as Eastern capital becoming ever more essential. The city that Constantine had founded existed in creative tension between its Roman heritage and its Christian destiny, between its Greek-speaking population and its Latin-speaking administration, between its European location and his orientation toward Asia. These tensions would never fully resolve. From them would emerge a distinctive civilization that was neither Roman, nor Greek, nor Asian, but something entirely new. The Byzantine world was taking shape. Those centuries would pass before anyone used that name, and Constantinople stood at its heart, the axis around which everything revolved. Walk in the streets of the new capital in those early decades, one would have encountered a city still under construction, still finding its identity. The classical statuary that lined the colonnaded avenues spoke of the pagan past, but the churches that rose on every side proclaimed a Christian future. Senators in Roman togas debated in a curia modeled on the Roman Senate House, but they spoke Greek among themselves and governed eastern provinces that had never known Latin as a living tongue. Chariot races in the Hippodrome followed traditions stretching back to ancient Greece, but the factions now carried religious and political meanings that would have puzzled earlier generations. Constantine had planted a seed in the soil of ancient Byzantium, and that seed would grow into something unprecedented in human history. His city would outlast the Western Empire by 1,000 years, would preserve the learning of antiquity through ages of darkness, and transmit it to a reawakening Europe. It would serve as a bulwark against waves of invasion that might otherwise have swept away civilization entirely, and it would inspire longing and desire in all who heard of its splendors. To the city that seemed to belong more to heaven than to earth. The decades following Constantine's death tested whether his creation could survive without its founder. His 3 sons divided the empire among themselves and immediately began scheming against one another. Within 13 years, 2 were dead and Constantius II ruled alone, only to face challenges from usurpers and the endless pressure of war on multiple frontiers. The dynasty that Constantine had established sputtered out in 363 when his nephew Julian, the last of the line, died from a Persian spear wound during an ill-conceived invasion of Mesopotamia. Emperors came and went with unsettling frequency, some competent, many less so, but Constantinople herself continued to grow, her population swelling, her importance to the empire deepening with each passing year. The reign of Theodosius I, who came to power in 379, marked a turning point that would shape the city's destiny for centuries to come. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule a unified Roman Empire, and even he spent most of his reign struggling to hold together what seemed determined to fly apart. The western provinces groaned under the weight of Germanic invasions, their tax revenues declining, their armies increasingly composed of the very barbarians they were meant to resist. The eastern provinces remained comparatively stable and prosperous, and Constantinople increasingly became the true center of imperial government. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the state, outlawing pagan worship and closing the ancient temples that had survived Constantine's revolution. The old gods who had watched over Rome for 1,000 years were banished. Their statues toppled or repurposed, their priesthoods dissolved. Constantinople, founded as a Christian city, now stood as the capital of an officially Christian empire, the great church that Constantine had begun. Dedicated to holy wisdom and called Hagia Sophia in Greek, dominated the skyline near the imperial palace and the Hippodrome, a physical declaration of the faith that now defined the Roman world. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire passed to his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division was meant to be administrative rather than permanent, a practical arrangement for governing distant provinces, but the 2 halves never reunited. The Western Empire, battered by invasion and hollowed by economic decay, staggered from crisis to crisis, while Constantinople watched from a safe distance. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 sent shockwaves through the entire Mediterranean world. The Eternal City, unviolated by foreign enemies for 800 years, had fallen to barbarian swords. Refugees fled eastward, bringing tales of horror and treasures salvaged from the wreckage. Constantinople absorbed these refugees and their wealth, growing stronger as the West grew weaker. The city's population may have reached 500,000 by the middle of the 5th century, making it the largest urban center in the Mediterranean world, now that Rome herself had declined. New walls rose to protect the expanding metropolis. The great Theodosian walls constructed during the reign of Theodosius II in the 410s. These fortifications stretched across the peninsula from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, a triple line of defenses featuring a moat, an outer wall, and a massive inner wall studded with towers. For 1,000 years, these walls would stand as the most formidable urban fortification in the world, turning back every enemy who dared approach. The Western Empire finally collapsed in 476, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last emperor and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Eastern emperors now claimed to rule the entire Roman inheritance, though in practice their authority extended only to the Greek-speaking East. Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Africa had passed into the hands of Germanic kings who paid lip service to Roman traditions while building something new on the ruins of the old order. Constantinople became the sole surviving capital of the Roman world, the keeper of traditions that had been extinguished elsewhere. For 2 generations after the Western collapse, the Eastern emperors focused on survival and consolidation, husbanding their resources while the barbarian kingdoms sorted themselves out. Then came Justinian, and everything changed. He ascended to the throne in 527, having served as the power behind his elderly uncle Justin. And he brought with him ambitions that matched those of any emperor since Augustus. Justinian dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, of reconquering the lost western provinces and reuniting the Mediterranean world under a single ruler. It was a vision of breathtaking audacity, and for a time it seemed within reach. Justinian's partner in this enterprise was his Empress Theodora. His origins could not have been more different from his own. She had been an actress and courtesan in Constantinople's demesne, a background that made her legally ineligible to marry a man of senatorial rank. Justinian changed the law to make her his wife, and she proved to be his most valuable counselor. A woman of iron will and sharp political instincts who complemented her husband's grandiose dreams with ruthless practicality. Together, they would transform Constantinople and the empire it ruled. The 5th year of Justinian's reign brought a crisis that nearly ended everything. In January of 532, riots erupted in the Hippodrome during the chariot races, as tensions between the blue and green factions boiled over into open violence. The racing factions had evolved into something like political parties, representing different social classes and theological positions, and their rivalry had become a channel for grievances against imperial taxation and governance. This time, the 2 factions made common cause against the emperor, uniting behind the cry of Nika, meaning victory or conquer. The riots spiraled into a full-scale insurrection that engulfed the city center, burning the original Hagia Sophia, the Senate House, and large portions of the surrounding neighborhoods. For 5 terrifying days, Justinian's grip on power hung by a thread. The rebels proclaimed a rival emperor, and the flames consuming the heart of Constantinople seemed to herald the end of Justinian's reign. The emperor prepared to flee, to board a ship and escape to safety while he still could. It was Theodora who stiffened his resolve. According to the historian Procopius, she addressed the imperial council with words that would echo through history. Purple, she declared, makes a fine burial shroud. She would rather die an empress than live a fugitive. Her courage shamed the men into action. Justinian's generals Belisarius and Mundus led loyal troops into the Hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered to acclaim their chosen emperor. What followed was a massacre. The soldiers sealed the exits and methodically slaughtered everyone trapped inside, killing perhaps 30,000 people in the bloodiest single day in Constantinople's history. The Nika revolt was over, and Justinian's power was more absolute than ever, purchased at a price in blood that would have horrified his predecessors. From the ashes of the revolt rose the greatest monument of Byzantine civilization. Justinian ordered the construction of a new Hagia Sophia, a church that would surpass anything the world had ever seen. He entrusted the project to Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, not architects in the traditional sense, but mathematicians and engineers who brought revolutionary concepts to their commission. They designed a structure that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a vast central dome that appeared to float above the nave, supported by an ingenious system of half-domes and pendentives that distributed the enormous weight to massive piers. Construction proceeded at a pace that astonished contemporaries, with 10,000 workers laboring day and night to realize the emperor's vision. Materials came from across the empire and beyond: porphyry columns from a temple in Egypt, green marble from Thessaly, yellow stone from Syria, and gold beyond counting to cover the mosaics that adorned every surface. When the church was dedicated on December 27, 537, less than 6 years after construction began, Justinian reportedly entered the completed building and exclaimed that he had surpassed Solomon. Whether or not he spoke those words, the sentiment was understandable. Hagia Sophia was the largest enclosed space in the world, a building that seemed to belong more to heaven than to earth. Meanwhile, Justinian's armies were remaking the map of the Mediterranean. Belisarius, the greatest general of the age, conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a lightning campaign that stunned observers with its speed and completeness. He then turned to Italy, getting a grinding war against the Ostrogoths that would drag on for 2 decades and reduce the Italian peninsula to a depopulated wasteland. Other armies pushed into southern Spain, reclaiming a strip of coastline from the Visigoths. For a moment, it seemed that the Mediterranean might once again become a Roman lake, but the costs of Justinian's ambitions were staggering, and fate delivered a blow from which the empire would never fully recover. In 541, a devastating plague arrived in Constantinople, carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. The disease, probably bubonic plague, swept through the overcrowded capital with terrifying speed. At its peak, the plague killed perhaps 10,000 people per day. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and mass graves overflowed with the dead. Justinian himself fell ill, but survived, one of the lucky minority who recovered from the infection. The plague returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, each visitation culling the population and disrupting the economy. Scholars estimate that the empire may have lost 1/4 to 1/3 of its population during the first pandemic cycle. Tax revenues collapsed, armies shrank, and the ambitious projects of reconquest ground to a halt. The territories that Belisarius had conquered at such cost became impossible to defend, and within a generation of Justinian's death in 565, much of what he had won began to slip away. Justinian left behind a transformed Constantinople, a city of monuments and churches that proclaimed the glory of Christian empire. But he also left an exhausted treasury, a depleted population, and enemies gathering on every frontier. The Persians pressed from the east, demanding tribute and threatening the wealthy provinces of Syria and Egypt. Germanic peoples continued to infiltrate the Balkans, settling on lands that the empire could no longer effectively govern. The dream of restoring Rome's ancient unity had proven to be just that, a dream, beautiful, but ultimately beyond reach. Yet Constantinople endured. The great walls still stood, the churches still lifted their domes toward heaven, and the emperors still ruled from the sacred palace overlooking the Bosphorus. The city had survived riot and plague, had watched the Western Empire die, and had claimed its inheritance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Constantinople had proven that she possessed a resilience that matched her splendor. The First Golden Age had established patterns that would persist for centuries, patterns of autocratic rule and orthodox faith, of military struggle and cultural achievement, of a city that saw itself as the center of the civilized world and the guardian of everything worth preserving. The century following Justinian's death tested Constantinople as she had never been tested before. The exhausted empire faced enemies on every side, and one by one, the provinces that had seemed secure began to fall away. The Lombards invaded Italy, reducing Byzantine holdings to a few coastal enclaves. The Slavs poured into the Balkans, settling on lands that imperial armies could no longer defend. And from the east came a threat that dwarfed all others, a Persian empire resurgent under aggressive kings who sensed that their ancient rival had never been weaker. The war with Persia that erupted in the early 7th century was the most devastating conflict the empire had experienced since the dark days of the 3rd century crisis. Persian armies swept through Syria and Palestine, capturing Jerusalem in 614 and carrying off the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom. Egypt fell next, and with it, the grain supply that fed Constantinople. The Persians pushed across Anatolia until their advance guards could see the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, close enough to gaze upon the walls of the capital itself. It seemed that the empire of the Romans might finally be extinguished, swallowed by the same Persian realm that Alexander had conquered 1,000 years before. The Emperor Heraclius, who had seized power in 610, staked everything on a desperate gamble. Rather than defend the shrinking perimeter of his empire, he launched a bold offensive into the heart of Persian territory, striking at the enemy's vulnerable center, while Persian armies were scattered across the conquered provinces. The campaign lasted years and brought Heraclius closer to destruction than any emperor before him, but his audacity was rewarded. In 628, Persia sued for peace, returning all the conquered territories and the sacred relics they had seized. Heraclius entered Jerusalem in triumph, restoring the true cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The empire had survived its greatest crisis and emerged apparently stronger than ever. The celebration proved tragically premature. Even as Heraclius savored his victory, new power was rising in the Arabian desert that would transform the world more completely than any force since Rome herself. The Prophet Muhammad had unified the Arab tribes under the banner of Islam, and his successors, the caliphs, directed the energies of this newly forged community outward in a wave of conquest that nothing could withstand. The exhausted empires of Rome and Persia, having bled each other white in their recent war, could offer little resistance. Syria fell to Arab armies in 636, just 8 years after Heraclius had recovered it from the Persians. Egypt followed in 642. Persia itself collapsed entirely, its ancient dynasty swept away as people converted to the faith of their conquerors. Constantinople watched these catastrophes unfold with mounting horror. Province after province, city after city, fell to the Arab advance. The wealthy lands that had funded the empire and fed its capital were gone, and the caliphate showed no sign of stopping. Arab fleets appeared in the Mediterranean, challenging Byzantine naval supremacy for the first time in centuries. Arab armies probed the defenses of Anatolia, raiding deeper each year, drawing ever closer to the capital. By the middle of the 7th century, it seemed only a matter of time before Constantinople herself would fall. The first great Arab siege came in 674, when a massive fleet appeared in the Sea of Marmara and established a base on the peninsula of Cyzicus, within easy striking distance of the capital. For 4 consecutive summers, the Arab forces assaulted Constantinople's defenses, attempting to breach the walls by land while their ships blockaded the sea approaches. Each year they were repulsed, and each winter they withdrew to their base to await the return of campaigning season. The siege dragged on for 4 years, a relentless test of endurance that strained the city's resources to the breaking point. What saved Constantinople was a weapon so terrible that it would become legendary throughout the medieval world. Greek fire, the Byzantines called it, though its exact composition remained a closely guarded state secret. This incendiary mixture could be projected from bronze tubes mounted on the prows of ships, spraying liquid flame that burned on water and could not be extinguished by conventional means. Arab sailors, accustomed to victory, found themselves facing a horror beyond anything they had imagined. Ships that approached too close erupted in flames that no amount of seawater could quench. Men leaped overboard only to find the burning substance clinging to their flesh. The Arab fleet was destroyed, and the survivors limped home bearing tales of the terrible fire that the Romans commanded. A 30-year truce followed, giving the empire a desperately needed respite. But the Arabs had not abandoned their ambition to capture the city that they called the Red Apple, the ultimate prize that would crown their conquests. In 717, they returned with an even larger force, perhaps the greatest armada the world had yet seen, carrying over 100,000 soldiers to finish what the earlier siege had begun. The new emperor, Leo III, had risen from obscure origins in the Syrian borderlands and understood the Arab threat as few of his predecessors had. He prepared Constantinople for the coming assault with methodical thoroughness, stockpiling food and weapons, strengthening the walls, and positioning his fleet to maximum advantage. When the Arab forces arrived, they found a city ready to resist to the last. The siege of 717 to 718 lasted over a year, and it was the Arabs who broke first. Greek fire once again devastated their fleet, destroying hundreds of ships and thousands of men. A brutal winter caught the besieging army unprepared, and soldiers who had marched from the warm lands of Syria and Egypt froze in their camps outside the walls. Disease swept through the Arab ranks, killing far more than Byzantine swords. Bulgarian forces, allied with the empire, attacked the Arab supply lines and slaughtered foraging parties. When spring came, the Caliph ordered a withdrawal. Barely a fraction of the great hosts that had set out returned home. The failure of the 717 siege marked a turning point in world history. Had Constantinople fallen, nothing would have prevented Arab armies from sweeping into the Balkans and Central Europe. The Christian kingdoms of the West, fragmented and weak, could not have resisted the force that had so easily devoured Persia and the Levant. The Byzantine capital, by holding firm behind its walls and deploying its terrible fire, had saved more than itself. It had saved a civilization. Leo III and his successors consolidated their victory, but also ignited a controversy that would convulse the empire for over a century. In 726, Leo ordered the removal of a famous icon of Christ that hung above the chalk gate, the ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace. His soldiers met violent resistance from the populace, who venerated such images as sacred windows into the divine realm. Leo persisted, issuing edicts that condemned the veneration of icons as idolatry and ordering the destruction of religious images throughout the empire. The iconoclast controversy had begun. The theological issues at stake were genuinely complex, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of Christ and the proper forms of Christian worship. But the controversy also reflected political tensions between the emperor and the church, between Constantinople and the provinces, between the Greek East and the Latin West. Popes in Rome condemned iconoclasm as heresy and broke communion with the iconoclast emperors. Monks, who produced and promoted icons, became the targets of imperial persecution. For over a century, the empire was divided between iconoclasts and iconodules, those who destroyed images and those who venerated them, with imperial policy swinging back and forth depending on which faction held power. The final restoration of icons came in 843, and the empire emerged from the controversy with its religious identity more firmly defined than ever. The Orthodox Church had developed a sophisticated theology of images, explaining how the veneration of icons differed from the worship due to God alone. The monasteries that had resisted iconoclasm enjoyed enhanced prestige and influence, and the split with Rome, though papered over for the moment, had widened into a chasm that would eventually become permanent. The resolution of the iconoclast controversy ushered in an era of revival and expansion that historians call the Macedonian Renaissance. Named for the dynasty founded by Basil I in 867, the empire went on the offensive for the first time in centuries, pushing back the Arab frontier in the east and reasserting control over the Balkans in the west. Byzantine armies recovered Crete and Cyprus, securing the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. Missionaries carried Orthodox Christianity to the Slavic peoples of the Balkans and beyond, converting the Bulgarians, the Serbs, and eventually the Russians to the faith of Constantinople. Constantinople herself entered a new golden age, her population recovering from the losses of plague and war, her wealth increasing as trade flowed through the crossroads of continents. The city may have housed 500,000 people at its peak, making it by far the largest urban center in the Christian world and rivaled only by a handful of cities. In China and the Islamic Caliphate, as visitors from Western Europe, accustomed to the modest towns of their homelands, struggled to describe a metropolis that seemed to belong to another order of existence entirely. The great church of Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, but hundreds of other churches had risen across the city, their domes and bell towers creating a forest of sacred architecture. The imperial palace complex sprawled across the southeastern corner of the peninsula, a labyrinth of throne rooms and reception halls, gardens and pavilions, where the emperor lived in a seclusion that bordered on the divine. Elaborate ceremonies governed every aspect of court life, transforming the mundane business of government into a sacred drama that proclaimed the emperor's role as God's representative on earth. Byzantine diplomacy became legendary for its sophistication and subtlety. Unable to match the raw military power of their neighbors, the emperors learned to manipulate through gold, marriage alliances, and carefully cultivated relationships with foreign rulers. The diplomatic service maintained detailed dossiers on every kingdom and chieftain that might pose a threat or offer an opportunity. Embassies arriving in Constantinople were subjected to carefully staged displays of imperial wealth and power, designed to overawe visitors and convince them that resistance was futile. The throne room featured mechanical lions that roared, artificial birds that sang, and a throne that could rise toward the ceiling, elevating the emperor to seemingly superhuman heights. The city's workshops produced luxury goods that were coveted throughout the known world. Byzantine silk, woven in imperial factories whose workers were forbidden to immigrate, commanded astronomical prices in the markets of Europe and Asia. Goldsmiths and jewelers created objects of breathtaking beauty, from reliquaries encrusted with gems to crowns and scepters that symbolized earthly power. Manuscript illuminators produced books that were works of art, their pages gleaming with gold leaf and intricate miniatures. Constantinople was not merely a political capital, but a manufacturing center whose products defined luxury for half a continent. Education and learning flourished as they had not since ancient times. The imperial university trained the bureaucrats who administered the empire, ensuring a supply of literate, competent officials who could manage the complex machinery of government. Scholars preserved and copied the texts of classical antiquity, maintaining a connection with the Greek and Roman past that had been severed in the West. Libraries held treasures of ancient wisdom that existed nowhere else, works of philosophy and science, history and literature that would later spark the Renaissance in Western Europe. Constantinople at its zenith was more than a city. It was an idea, a symbol, a dream of what civilization could achieve when guided by faith and sustained by tradition. Those who lived within her walls believed themselves to be the heirs of Rome and the guardians of Christianity, blessed by God and destined to endure until the end of time. The walls that had turned back Persians and Arabs would surely hold against whatever challenges the future might bring. This confidence, rooted in centuries of survival against impossible odds, would be tested as never before in the centuries to come. The confidence that sustained Constantinople through centuries of struggle rested on foundations that seemed unshakable. The empire was the legitimate heir of Rome, the guardian of Orthodox Christianity, the center of civilization in a world of barbarians. Yet beneath this serene certainty, cracks had been forming for generations, fault lines that would eventually rupture and bring catastrophe upon the city that believed itself invincible. The greatest of these fractures ran not along any physical frontier, but through the heart of Christendom itself, dividing the Greek East from the Latin West in a schism that is never fully healed. The churches of Rome and Constantinople had been drifting apart for centuries, separated by language, culture, and increasingly divergent theological traditions. The Pope in Rome claimed universal authority over all Christians as the successor of St. Peter, while the Patriarch in Constantinople acknowledged no superior but Christ himself and regarded the Roman bishop as merely first among equals. Disputes over doctrine accumulated like sediment, each controversy leaving residue that hardened into permanent disagreement. The West had added a single word to the Nicene Creed, declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, a modification that Eastern theologians rejected as unauthorized innovation. The East permitted married clergy and used leavened bread in the Eucharist, practices that Latin reformers condemned as corrupt. These theological disputes might have remained the concern of scholars and churchmen had they not become entangled with political rivalries and wounded pride. In 1054, a papal delegation arrived in Constantinople, bearing demands for submission to Roman authority. Patriarch Michael Cerularius was a proud and combative man who had no intention of yielding to what he considered Latin arrogance. The negotiations, conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and cultural contempt, collapsed into acrimony. On July 16th, the papal legates marched into Hagia Sophia during the celebration of the Divine Liturgy and placed a bull of excommunication on the high altar, condemning the Patriarch and all who followed him. Cerularius responded by excommunicating the legates and everyone associated with them. The Great Schism had begun. At the time, few recognized the event as the decisive break it would prove to be. Excommunications had been exchanged before and subsequently lifted when tempers cooled, but this rupture proved permanent, hardening over the following centuries into an unbridgeable divide between Catholic West and Orthodox East. Constantinople now stood as the capital, not merely of an empire, but of a distinct Christian civilization, one that viewed Rome with suspicion and increasingly with hostility. The Crusades that would soon convulse the Mediterranean world would deepen this estrangement until it became hatred. The late 11th century brought a new threat from the east that would indirectly draw Western warriors to the gates of Constantinople. The Seljuk Turks, nomadic invaders from the Central Asian steppes, had converted to Islam and carved out an empire stretching from Persia to the borders of Byzantine Anatolia. Commute in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Kish's army annihilated the Byzantine field force and captured the Emperor Romanos IV himself. The disaster opened Anatolia to Turkish settlement, and within a generation, the heartland that had sustained the empire for centuries was lost. Constantinople still stood behind her mighty walls, but the provinces that had provided her soldiers and her taxes were slipping away. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who clawed his way to power in 1081 after years of civil war, faced an impossible strategic situation. Enemies pressed from every direction. The Normans of southern Italy, led by the ambitious Robert Guiscard, threatened the empire's remaining possessions in the Western Balkans. Turkish raiders penetrated deeper into Anatolia each year. The treasury was empty, the army shattered, the administration in chaos. Alexios needed help, and he looked westward to find it. In 1095, Alexios sent envoys to Pope Urban II, requesting mercenary soldiers to help recover the lost territories. In Asia Minor, he expected a modest force of professional warriors who would serve under Byzantine command. What he received instead was something unprecedented, a mass movement of armed pilgrims numbering in the tens of thousands, fired by religious zeal and dreams of glory, answering the Pope's call to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The First Crusade had begun, and Constantinople found herself directly in its path. The arrival of the Crusaders presented Alexios with a dilemma of extraordinary delicacy. These Western warriors were nominally allies, fellow Christians come to fight against a common enemy, but they were also a barely controlled horde passing through imperial territory, consuming resources, clashing with local populations, and led by ambitious nobles who owed no allegiance to Constantinople. Alexios needed to direct their energies against the Turks while preventing them from carving out independent principalities on lands the empire still claimed. Through a masterpiece of diplomacy, Alexios managed to extract oaths of fealty from most of the crusade leaders, securing promises that any former Byzantine territory they conquered would be returned to the empire. He provided guides, supplies, and naval support for the crossing into Asia Minor, carefully shepherding the dangerous guests through his capital and on toward the enemy. The strategy worked, at least initially. The Crusaders captured Nicaea and returned it to Byzantine control, then smashed the Turkish army at Dorylaeum and opened the road to Syria and Palestine. But the promises extracted under duress proved worthless once the Crusaders established themselves in the Levant. Instead of returning conquered territories to Alexios, the Crusade leaders created independent states: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Antioch was particularly galling, for it had been one of the great cities of the Byzantine world, seat of an ancient patriarchate, and its Norman ruler showed nothing but contempt for imperial claims. Relations between Constantinople and the Crusader states were poisoned from the beginning by mutual accusations of betrayal and bad faith. The Comnenian dynasty that Alexios founded managed to stabilize the empire and even achieve a partial recovery of lost territories. His son, John II, and grandson, Manuel I, were capable rulers and skilled generals who pushed back the Turkish frontier and reasserted Byzantine influence in the Balkans. Constantinople experienced a cultural flowering during this period, her scholars and artists producing works of enduring beauty, her diplomats weaving intricate webs of alliance and influence across the Mediterranean world. For a time, it seemed that the empire might reclaim something of its former greatness. Manuel I, in particular, cultivated relationships with Western powers, hosting tournaments in the Latin style, patronizing Western artists and scholars, and dreaming of reuniting the churches under Byzantine leadership. He intervened repeatedly in the affairs of the Crusader states, sometimes as ally, sometimes as antagonist, always seeking to extend Constantinople's reach. His ambitions exceeded his resources, and the military disasters of his later reign revealed the fragility of the Comnenian achievement. When Manuel died in 1180, he left behind a child heir, a depleted treasury, and enemies who sensed weakness. The decades following Manuel's death brought civil war, usurpation, and massacre that destroyed the stability his dynasty had built. Anti-Latin sentiment, fed by resentment of Western arrogance and economic competition, exploded in 1182 when a Constantinople mob slaughtered the Italian merchants who had dominated the city's trade. Men, women, and children were killed indiscriminately, their bodies thrown into the harbor, the sick dragged from hospital beds to be murdered. The papal legate was beheaded and his head tied to the tail of a dog. News of the massacre spread throughout the West, adding fresh grievance to the accumulated resentments that poisoned relations between the two halves of Christendom. Among those most aggrieved were the Venetians, whose merchants had been prominent among the victims. Venice had long enjoyed special trading privileges in Constantinople, maintaining a quarter of the city where her citizens lived under their own laws and conducted a business that made them rich beyond imagination. The Republic's relationship with the empire had always been transactional, alliance purchased with commercial concessions, but now it curdled into something darker. Venetian ships still sailed to Constantinople. Venetian merchants still traded in her markets. But the Republic remembered the massacre and waited for an opportunity to settle accounts. The empire that entered the final decade of the 12th century was a shadow of what it had been under the great Constantinian emperors. Civil wars had drained the treasury and decimated the army. Provinces were restive, their populations exhausted by taxation and misgovernment. The Turkish frontier had stabilized, but not in the empire's favor, with Turkish sultanates now permanently established in lands that had been Byzantine for centuries. And in the west, a new crusade was gathering, one that would be shaped by Venetian ambition and redirected toward a target its original planners had never imagined. Constantinople's relationship with the West had become toxic, a compound of theological dispute, commercial rivalry, cultural contempt, and accumulated grievance. The crusading movement that had begun as a response to Byzantine appeals for help had evolved into something the empire could not control and increasingly feared. Western knights who passed through Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land saw a city of fabulous wealth inhabited by people they considered effeminate, treacherous, and barely Christian. Byzantine officials who dealt with these rough warriors saw ignorant barbarians whose pretensions to piety barely masked crude ambition and greed. Both sides bore responsibility for the deterioration of relations, but the consequences would fall disproportionately on Constantinople. The city's wealth, her strategic position, her ancient claim to Roman inheritance, all made her a target for those who coveted what she possessed. The theological schism provided justification. The commercial rivalry provided motivation. And the chaos within the empire provided opportunity. The catastrophe that was coming would surpass anything the city had endured in her long history. Worse than the Persian sieges, worse than the Arab assaults. A betrayal that would strip Constantinople of her treasures and her dignity and leave wounds that would never fully heal. Yet, as the 12th century drew to a close, the people of Constantinople still believed in their city's destiny. The walls had held against every enemy for 800 years. The empire had survived crises that would have destroyed lesser states. Hagia Sophia still lifted her dome toward heaven. The emperor still ruled from the sacred palace, and the rhythms of court and church continued as they had for generations. Confidence, born of centuries of survival, blinded the Byzantines to the magnitude of the danger gathering in the west. They had faced crusaders before and emerged intact. They could not imagine that the next crusade would bring not deliverance, but destruction. The seeds of catastrophe had been planted in the schism of 1054, watered by the blood of 1182, and nurtured by decades of mutual suspicion and contempt. Now they were about to bear fruit of unimaginable bitterness. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the second Rome, the center of the civilized world, was about to experience a fall from which she would never fully recover. The glory that had accumulated over 8 centuries would be scattered to the winds. And the city that had seemed eternal would learn that even the mightiest walls cannot protect against treachery from those who should have been friends. The Fourth Crusade began with the noblest of intentions, or so its organizers claimed. Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff of the medieval era, called for a new expedition to reclaim Jerusalem, which had fallen to Saladin in 1187 and remained in Muslim hands despite the efforts of previous crusades. The response from the nobility of France and Flanders was enthusiastic, and by 1201 an army of perhaps 30,000 men had taken the cross and prepared to embark for the Holy Land. They would need ships to carry them, and for ships they turned to the only power capable of providing them. They turned to Venice. The Venetian Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was over 80 years old and nearly blind, but his mind remained as sharp as any in Europe. He negotiated a contract that would shape the fate of empires. Venice would provide ships sufficient to transport the crusading army, along with provisions for a year and a naval escort of 50 war galleys. In exchange, the crusaders would pay 85,000 silver marks, an enormous sum that reflected the enormous scale of the undertaking. The contract was signed, the ships were built, and Venice waited for the crusaders to arrive and pay what they owed. The crusaders gathered in Venice in the summer of 1202, but their numbers fell far short of what had been projected. Many who had taken the cross, made their own way to the Holy Land, unwilling to submit to the centralized command that the Venetian contract implied. Those who arrived in Venice could not pay what they owed, no matter how they scraped and borrowed. The debt hung over the expedition like a curse, threatening to dissolve the crusade before it had properly begun. Dandolo proposed a solution that would have fateful consequences. The city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast had recently rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Dandolo offered to defer the Crusaders' debt if they would help Venice recapture this wayward possession. The proposal was controversial, for Hungary was a Christian kingdom, and its king had himself taken the Crusaders' vow. Attacking Zara meant attacking fellow Christians, a perversion of the crusading ideal that troubled many in the army. But the alternative was the dissolution of the entire enterprise, and so the Crusaders agreed. In November 1202, the combined fleet descended on Zara and sacked it, despite the inhabitants hanging crosses from their walls to remind the attackers of their shared faith. Pope Innocent excommunicated the entire crusade for the attack on Zara, though he later lifted the sentence from all except the Venetians, who showed no remorse. The army wintered in the captured city, and it was there that an opportunity arose that would divert the crusade to a target far more consequential than Zara. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived in the Crusader camp, bearing promises that seemed too good to be true. They were: Alexios was the son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, who had been blinded and imprisoned by his own brother in one of the coups that plagued the dying Byzantine state. The young prince had escaped to the west and now sought military assistance to restore his father to the throne. In exchange, he offered the Crusaders everything they could desire. He would pay the debt to Venice and provide additional funds for the campaign in Egypt. He would supply soldiers and ships for the crusade. We would place the Byzantine Church under papal authority, healing the schism that had divided Christendom for a century and a half. And he would provision the crusading army for an additional year. It was an extraordinary offer, and the Crusaders were desperate enough to believe it. Dandolo saw in this proposal the opportunity to settle old scores and establish Venetian dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Other leaders were genuinely convinced that restoring the legitimate emperor would benefit both the crusade and the cause of Christian unity. Some protested that attacking Constantinople was an even greater violation of crusading principles than the sack of Zara, and a significant minority of the army refused to participate, making their own way to the Holy Land, but the majority followed their leaders toward the greatest city in the Christian world. The Crusader fleet appeared before Constantinople in June 1203, and the Byzantines discovered that their legendary walls were not designed to resist attack from the sea. The Golden Horn had always been protected by a massive chain stretched across its mouth, preventing enemy vessels from entering the sheltered harbor. But the sea walls along the Bosphorus and the Marmara were lower and less formidable than the great land walls, adequate against medieval naval technology, but vulnerable to a determined assault. The Venetians attacked the sea walls while the Crusader knights assaulted the land defenses. And the usurper, Alexios III, uncle of the pretender, discovered that his support had evaporated. He fled the city under cover of darkness, carrying as much treasure as he could gather. The blind Isaac II was released from prison and restored to his throne, with his son as emperor. The Crusaders camped outside the walls, waiting for the promised payments that would send them on their way to Egypt and the Holy Land. But young Alexios discovered what his desperation had prevented him from seeing. The treasury was empty, looted by the fled usurper and drained by decades of mismanagement. The church refused to submit to Rome, and the population that had welcomed liberation from a tyrant grew hostile when they realized that submission to the Latins was the price of that liberation. Alexios could not deliver what he had promised, and the Crusaders grew impatient. The winter of 1203 to 1204 saw relations between the Crusaders and the Byzantines deteriorate from uneasy alliance to open hostility. Fires set during skirmishes burned large sections of the city. The population turned against the emperors who had brought the Latins to their gates. In January, a palace coup overthrew Isaac and Alexios, murdering the young conqueror and raising a new ruler who repudiated all obligations to the Crusaders. The pretense of alliance was over. The Crusaders had not been paid, and they were stranded far from home with winter seas preventing their departure. They decided to take by force what had been promised and not delivered. The assault began on April 9, 1204, with a Venetian attack on the sea walls along the Golden Horn. The first attempt failed, the attackers thrown back by defenders who had finally found the will to resist. But 4 days later, a second assault succeeded. Venetian ships, lashed together, carried flying bridges that allowed knights to leap directly onto the walls. A small gate was broken open, and crusaders poured into the city. The Byzantine resistance, disorganized and demoralized by months of turmoil, collapsed almost immediately. The emperor fled, and Constantinople lay open to its conquerors. What followed was 3 days of systematic pillage that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to the brutalities of medieval warfare. The Crusaders had been promised that they could plunder the city for 3 days before order would be restored, and they made the most of their opportunity. Churches were stripped of their sacred vessels, their icons, their reliquaries containing the bones of saints. The altar of Hagia Sophia was smashed for the precious metals it contained. A prostitute was enthroned in the patriarch's seat and sang Baudi songs while drunken soldiers caroused in the sacred space. Palaces and mansions were looted of everything portable, and what could not be carried was often destroyed. The Byzantines had accumulated treasures over 9 centuries, the concentrated wealth of the ancient world preserved and augmented through generations. Now it was scattered, melted down, carried off to Venice and France and Flanders. Bronze statues that had survived from classical antiquity were fed into furnaces to be recast as coins. Libraries were burned or dispersed, their precious manuscripts lost forever. The accumulated artistic heritage of a millennium was destroyed in 3 days of greed and violence. Historians estimate that more was lost in the sack of Constantinople than in all the barbarian invasions that had ended the Western Roman Empire 7 centuries before. When the looting finally ceased, the victors divided the spoils and the empire according to a treaty they had prepared in advance. Venice claimed 3/8 of Constantinople itself, including the crucial harbor facilities, along with strategic territories throughout the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. A Latin emperor would rule from the Byzantine throne, and the first to hold this dubious honor was Baldwin of Flanders, elected by the Crusade leadership over the bitter objections of Boniface of Montferrat. The Orthodox Patriarch was expelled and a Latin appointed in his place. The Byzantine Empire, or what remained of it, was parceled out among the Crusaders as fiefs to be held in the Western feudal manner. But the conquerors held only Constantinople and scattered coastal territories. Byzantine successor states emerged in the provinces, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of the Roman Empire. In distant Trebizond, on the Black Sea coast, descendants of the Comnene dynasty established an independent realm that would survive for centuries. Epirus, in northwestern Greece, another claimant state, took shape. And most importantly, in Nicaea, across the Bosphorus in Asia Minor, the nobility who had escaped Constantinople rallied around Theodore Lascaris, who was crowned emperor in 1208 and vowed to recover the lost capital. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was doomed from its birth. It lacked the resources to control the territories it claimed, the legitimacy to command loyalty from the Greek population, and the unity to coordinate effective defense against its many enemies. The Latin emperors pawned the relics that were Constantinople's most precious possessions, selling the crown of thorns to King Louis IX of France when they could no longer pay their debts. The city's population dwindled as Greeks fled to the successor states and commerce withered under Latin mismanagement. The great metropolis that had dazzled visitors from across the known world became a half-empty ruin. Kara Palace is crumbling, her churches stripped of their ornaments. The Orthodox faithful throughout the Byzantine world regarded the Latin occupation as a catastrophe of eschatological proportions. The Holy City had fallen to schismatics and heretics, her churches desecrated, her sacred treasures profaned. The hatred generated by the Fourth Crusade poisoned relations between Eastern and Western Christianity beyond any hope of reconciliation. When later popes attempted to negotiate reunion of the churches, Byzantine populations rejected any accommodation with the Latins who had violated Constantinople. The wound was too deep, the memory too raw. The crusade that was supposed to unite Christendom against Islam had instead inflicted a blow from which Christendom would never recover. For 57 years, Latin emperors sat on the throne of Constantine, each more desperate than the last. The city they ruled shrank within her vast walls, whole quarters abandoned, monuments falling into decay. The sea walls that the Venetians had breached were never properly repaired. The fleet that had once dominated the eastern Mediterranean rotted in the harbors. Everything that had made Constantinople great was being consumed by rulers who could not maintain what they had taken and would not return it to those who could. In Nicaea, the exiled empire gathered strength. The Lascarid dynasty proved competent and determined, rebuilding the military, reforming the administration, and nurturing a fierce determination to recover the sacred city. Across the Bosphorus, the Greeks could see the domes of their lost capital, a daily reminder of what had been taken and what must be reclaimed. The Orthodox Church in exile kept alive the spiritual legitimacy of the Byzantine cause, blessing the armies that would one day cross the narrow strait and restore what the Crusaders had stolen. The Latin Empire was dying, its territories shrinking year by year, its emperors begging for help from a West that had lost interest. The Greeks were coming home, and Constantinople, the city of world's desire, was waiting to receive them. The occupation had been long and bitter, but it would not last forever. The walls that had failed in 1204 would soon witness a different kind of assault, one carried out not by enemies but by rightful heirs returning to claim their inheritance. The empire in exile had waited 57 years for this moment. In the summer of 1261, a small Byzantine force under the general Alexios Strategopoulos was conducting reconnaissance near Constantinople when local sympathizers informed him of an extraordinary opportunity. The Latin garrison had departed on a naval expedition, leaving the city virtually undefended. A handful of soldiers knew of a passage through the walls, a secret entrance that the Latins had never discovered. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 25th, Strategopoulos led his men through this hidden gate and into the sleeping city. The few Latin defenders who remained were overwhelmed before they could organize resistance. The Latin Emperor Baldwin II fled so hastily that he left his crown and scepter behind, escaping by ship to a lifetime of exile and fruitless scheming. By the time the sun rose over the Bosphorus, the Byzantine banner flew once more above the walls of Constantinople. The city that the Fourth Crusade had stolen was restored to her rightful heirs, not through a great siege or a decisive battle, but through a stroke of fortune that seemed like divine providence to the Orthodox faithful who had prayed for this day through decades of humiliation. Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos entered his recovered capital on August 15th. The Feast of the Assumption, walking barefoot behind an icon of the Virgin Mary in a procession of thanksgiving that wound through streets still scarred by Latin neglect. The joy of the moment was genuine, but Michael was too shrewd to mistake recovery for restoration. The city he had reclaimed bore little resemblance to the Constantinople that had fallen in 1204. The population had dwindled to perhaps 35,000, scattered across an urban landscape built for 10 times that number. Whole quarters stood abandoned, their buildings collapsing into ruin, their streets overgrown with weeds. The treasures that had accumulated over 9 centuries were gone, carried off to Venice and other western cities and the infrastructure that had supported Byzantine prosperity had decayed beyond easy repair. Kana set about rebuilding with energy and determination, but the resources available to him were pathetically inadequate to the task. The empire he ruled was a shadow of what Justinian had commanded. Oh, even what the Comnenian emperors had governed before the catastrophe. Anatolia, the heartland that had provided soldiers and taxes for centuries, was lost to Turkish sultanates that showed no intention of yielding their conquests. The Balkans were fragmented among competing powers, and Byzantine authority extended only to portions of Thrace and Macedonia. The despotate of the Morea in southern Greece acknowledged Constantinople's suzerainty, but it was too distant and too poor to provide meaningful support. The empire survived on the sufferance of its neighbors and the manipulation of their rivalries. The Latin powers had not accepted their expulsion gracefully. Charles of Anjou, the ambitious French prince who had seized southern Italy from the last of the Hohenstaufen, dreamed of establishing a Mediterranean empire with Constantinople as its crown jewel. He gathered allies, assembled fleets, and prepared an invasion that would dwarf the Fourth Crusade. Michael countered with every weapon available to Byzantine diplomacy, subsidizing rebellions against Charles, forging alliances with his enemies, and most controversially, offering reunion with the Roman Church in exchange for papal protection against Latin aggression. The Union of Lyon, proclaimed in 1274, represented Michael's attempt to neutralize the Western threat by removing its religious justification. If the Orthodox Church submitted to papal authority, how could the Pope bless a crusade against Constantinople? The strategy was clever, but deeply unpopular among Michael's own subjects. The Byzantine population remembered the sack of 1204 with undimmed hatred and viewed any accommodation with Rome as betrayal. Monks led the opposition, denouncing the union as apostasy and suffering imprisonment, and worse for their defiance. Michael enforced submission to the union with increasing brutality, blinding and mutilating those who resisted. But he could not compel genuine acceptance of what most Byzantines regarded as a bargain with the devil. The union collapsed almost immediately after Michael's death in 1282. His son and successor, Andronicus II, repudiated the agreement, restored the anti-unionist clergy to their positions, returned the church to its traditional independence from Rome. The price of this reversal became apparent soon enough. Charles of Anjou had been planning his great invasion when a popular uprising in Sicily, the famous Sicilian Vespers of 1282, destroyed his power base and forced him to abandon his eastern ambitions. But the reprieve was temporary. Without the protection that union with Rome had theoretically provided, Constantinople was once again vulnerable to any Latin power that chose to attack. Andronicus II ruled for nearly 50 years, and his reign witnessed the acceleration of decline that would eventually prove fatal. The economy contracted as the Italians, particularly the Genoese and Venetians, came to dominate the trade that had once enriched Byzantine merchants. These Western traders enjoyed privileges that exempted them from customs duties, allowing them to undercut their Byzantine competitors and drain wealth from the empire. Constantinople became a transit point where foreign merchants grew rich while the native population sank into poverty. The tax revenues that might have funded armies and fleets flowed instead into Italian coffers. The military situation deteriorated with equal speed. Unable to afford professional soldiers, Andronicus disbanded much of the army and relied on diplomacy and mercenaries to defend his shrinking realm. The mercenaries proved as dangerous as the enemies they were hired to fight. The Catalan Company, a band of Spanish adventurers who had served in the wars of Sicily, offered their services to Constantinople in 1303. They won victories against the Turks, but also plundered Byzantine territory with enthusiasm, eventually establishing their own state in Greece that would last for generations. The empire had become so weak that it could not control the forces it hired for its own defense. The Turks who pressed against the empire's eastern frontier were no longer the Seljuks who had dominated Anatolia for 2 centuries. The Seljuk Sultanate had fragmented into a patchwork of smaller states called beyliks, each ruled by its own Turkish warlord. Among these minor principalities was one led by a chieftain named Osman. His territory bordered the remaining Byzantine possessions in northwestern Anatolia. Osman and his successors would transform their modest beylik into the Ottoman Empire. But in the early 14th century, they were merely one thread among many traitors who probed Byzantine defenses and absorbed Byzantine territory piece by piece. The reign of Andronikos II ended in civil war, a pattern that would repeat with devastating consequences throughout the final century of Byzantine history. His grandson, Andronikos III, challenged him for the throne, and the empire tore itself apart in a conflict that lasted from 1321 to 1328. The younger Andronikos eventually prevailed. But the war had exhausted resources that the empire could not spare and demonstrated to every enemy that Byzantium was too divided to defend itself effectively. Andronikos III proved more energetic than his grandfather, attempting reforms and even winning some military successes. But his early death in 1341 triggered another civil war, even more destructive than the first. His chief minister, John Kantakouzenos, claimed the regency for the young heir John V Palaiologos, but powerful factions at court rejected his authority. The conflict that followed lasted 6 years, drawing in foreign powers who exploited Byzantine weakness for their own advantage. The Serbian king Stefan Dusant conquered vast territories in Macedonia and northern Greece, briefly creating an empire that seemed poised to supplant Byzantium entirely. The Ottomans, invited to intervene by Kantakouzenos himself, crossed into Europe for the first time and established permanent footholds on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The civil war ended with Kantakouzenos as senior emperor alongside John V, but the damage was irreparable. The Ottoman presence in Europe would never be dislodged. The Serbian Empire of Stefan Dusan would outlast its founder by only a few years. The territories he had taken would not return to Byzantine control. Constantinople ruled an empire that existed more in theory than in fact, a collection of scattered territories with no strategic coherence and no means of mutual support. Yet, even as the political and military situation disintegrated, Byzantine culture experienced a remarkable flowering. The Paleologan era produced some of the finest art and scholarship in Byzantine history, a last burst of creativity before the final darkness. Mosaics and frescoes of extraordinary beauty adorned the churches of Constantinople and the provinces. Scholars recovered and copied classical texts, laying the groundwork for the transmission of Greek learning to the West that would help spark the Renaissance. Theological debates of great sophistication engaged questions about the nature of divine light and the possibility of mystical union with God. The Sychasis controversy, which convulsed the Byzantine Church in the mid-14th century, produced theological insights that remain central to Orthodox spirituality today. Gregory Palamas defended the practices of contemplative monks who sought direct experience of God through prayer and asceticism, arguing that humans could genuinely participate in divine energies distinct from the unknowable divine essence. His opponents condemned this teaching as innovation, but a church council in 1351 vindicated Palamas and enshrined Hesychasm as orthodox doctrine. It was a remarkable achievement for a society seemingly on the verge of extinction, proof that spiritual and intellectual vitality could flourish even amid political collapse. The scholars who gathered in Constantinople during these twilight decades would carry Byzantine learning westward as the empire contracted and finally fell. Manuel Chrysolaris traveled to Italy in 1397 and taught Greek to eager students who had previously known the classical heritage only through Latin translations. Bessarion, who would later become a cardinal of the Roman Church, brought his library of Greek manuscripts to Italy and bequeathed it to Venice, where it became the nucleus of the great Marciana library. Countless others followed, fleeing the advancing Ottomans and carrying with them the intellectual treasures of a dying civilization. Constantinople in the early 15th century was a city of ghosts and memories. The population had fallen below 50,000, perhaps far below, rattling around within walls built for 500,000. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned, their buildings cannibalized for materials, their streets given over to orchards and vegetable gardens. The great palaces of the Byzantine aristocracy stood empty or ruinous, their former inhabitants fled or impoverished. Only the churches maintained something of their ancient splendor, their icons and mosaics preserved by the devotion of congregations, too poor to commission new works, but too faithful to abandon what remained. The emperors who ruled this melancholy domain had few resources and fewer options. They traveled to the west, begging for help, submitted to humiliating demands from Ottoman sultans, married their daughters to Turkish princes, and watched helplessly as the boundaries of their realm contracted with each passing decade. They quarreled among themselves, staged coups and countercoups, blinded and imprisoned rivals from their own family. The dysfunction that had plagued Byzantine politics throughout the 14th century continued into the 15th, ensuring that the empire would face its final crisis, divided and exhausted. And yet, Constantinople endured. The walls still stood, the churches still offered the divine liturgy, the emperors still claimed the inheritance of Rome. The city had survived so much across her long history: Casian sieges and Arab assaults, Latin occupation and Bulgarian wars. Perhaps she would survive this too. Perhaps some miracle would intervene, some shift in the balance of power that would grant the empire another reprieve. Such hopes had proven justified before. They were about to be tested as never before. For across the Bosphorus, a young sultan was dreaming of the day when he would ride through those legendary walls and make the city of Constantine his own. Its 14th century had witnessed the transformation of the Ottoman Beylik from a minor frontier principality into the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean. What had begun as a band of warriors raiding Byzantine borderlands had become an empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, and Constantinople found herself increasingly isolated within a sea of Ottoman territory. The city that had once commanded an empire now controlled little more than her own walls and a few scattered possessions that grew fewer with each passing decade. The reign of Byzas I, who came to power in 1389, brought the Ottoman threat to its most acute phase yet. Bayezid was a warrior of legendary energy, earning the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed with which he moved his armies across vast distances. He completed the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans, crushing a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian, and Bulgarian forces at the Battle of Kosovo, and reducing the Christian kingdoms of southeastern Europe to vassalage or extinction. He then turned his attention to the prize that had eluded his predecessors, the ancient capital that still defied Ottoman power. In 1394, Bayezid began a blockade of Constantinople that would last 8 grinding years. Ottoman forces encircled the city by land, cutting off the agricultural hinterland that had once fed the capital's teeming population. The population was no longer teeming. Decades of decline had reduced Constantinople to perhaps 50,000 souls, a fraction of her former glory, rattling around within walls built to protect 500,000. Whole quarters stood empty, their buildings crumbling, their streets overgrown. The great city had become a collection of villages, separated by fields and orchards, clustered around the major churches and the remnants of the imperial administration. Emperor Manuel II, Palaiologos, who ascended to the throne in 1391, faced a situation of unrelenting grimness. His treasury was empty, his army negligible, his empire reduced to Constantinople itself and a few coastal towns in the Peloponnese. He had been forced to serve as a vassal in Bayezid's army, fighting alongside the Ottomans against fellow Christians, a humiliation that captured the desperate straits to which the once mighty Roman Empire had fallen. Now he watched Ottoman forces tighten their grip around his capital, and he could see no way to break free. The blockade brought slow strangulation rather than dramatic assault. Bayezid seemed content to let hunger and despair do his work for him, knowing that Constantinople could not hold out indefinitely without relief from outside. The harvests that had sustained the city were now in Ottoman hands. Trade that had flowed through the Bosphorus was now subject to Ottoman tolls and restrictions. Each year brought new privations, new shortages, new evidence that the end was approaching. Manuel turned to the only source of help that might make a difference. He traveled to the courts of Western Europe, spending 3 years abroad in an unprecedented diplomatic mission that took him to Venice, Paris, and London. He cut a striking figure. This last emperor of the Romans, dignified and learned, representing a civilization that Westerners associated with ancient glory and exotic splendor. He was received with honors, entertained at banquets, promised assistance that never materialized. The Western powers expressed sympathy for Constantinople's plight and did nothing practical to relieve it. They had their own concerns, their own wars, their own priorities. Hence, the distant Byzantine capital was someone else's problem. So what saved Constantinople was not Western aid, but Eastern catastrophe. In 1402, a conqueror rose from the steppes of Central Asia whose ambitions dwarfed even those of Byzas the Thunderbolt. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, had built an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean, and he would tolerate no rival. When Bayezid refused to acknowledge Timurid's suzerainty, Timur gathered an army of perhaps 500,000 men and marched westward to teach the upstart Ottoman a lesson in the realities of power. The two armies met at Ankara in July 1402, and the result was the most devastating defeat the Ottomans had ever suffered. Bayezid's forces were annihilated, and the Sultan himself was captured, dying in Timurid captivity the following year. The Ottoman state, which had seemed on the verge of swallowing Constantinople, suddenly collapsed into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought over the succession. The blockade of Constantinople was lifted, and the city that had been hours from surrender was granted an unexpected reprieve. The Byzantine reaction to this miraculous deliverance was not what might have been expected. Rather than using the breathing space to rebuild their strength, the emperors became entangled in Ottoman dynastic politics, backing various contenders for the Sultanate in hopes of maintaining Ottoman weakness. It was a dangerous game that produced short-term benefits and long-term disaster. The Byzantines helped ensure that no strong sultan emerged for 2 decades, but they also earned the lasting enmity of whoever eventually won the succession struggle. Manuel II used the years of Ottoman weakness to strengthen Constantinople's defenses and repair the damage of the long blockade. The great walls were patched and reinforced, the towers garrisoned, the cisterns cleaned and refilled. But these were defensive measures, preparations for a siege that everyone knew would eventually come. The empire had no capacity for offensive action, no ability to recover lost territories, no hope of anything beyond survival. The best Manuel could achieve was to buy time, and time was running out. The Ottoman Civil War ended in 1413 with the victory of Mehmed I, who proved to be a capable and relatively moderate ruler. He maintained peaceful relations with Constantinople, recognizing that his battered state needed time to recover from the disaster at Ankara. His son, Mehmed II, who succeeded him in 1421, initially continued this policy, but the temptation to finish what his great-grandfather had begun proved irresistible. In 1422, Murad laid siege to Constantinople, testing the walls with his artillery and his infantry. The siege of 1422 revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Constantinople's position. The walls held, as they had held for 1,000 years, their triple line of defenses, too formidable for the Ottoman army to breach. But the siege also revealed how close the defenders were to exhaustion. The garrison was pathetically small, perhaps a few thousand men to defend walls that stretched for miles. The population was too diminished to provide the manpower that earlier sieges had commanded. Only the intervention of a pretender to the Ottoman throne supported by Byzantine gold, forced Murad to withdraw and deal with the threat to his rear. The Byzantines had survived once more, but the pattern was clear. Each crisis left them weaker, each recovery more incomplete than the last. The Ottomans grew stronger with each generation, while Byzantium continued her long decline. It was only a matter of time before an Ottoman sultan came who would not be distracted, who would not be bought off, who would bring sufficient force to breach those ancient walls once and for all. The decades following the 1422 siege saw the Ottoman noose tighten inexorably. Murad II conquered Thessalonica, the second city of the Byzantine world, in 1430, massacring or enslaving much of the population. He annexed the remaining Byzantine territories in the Balkans, reducing the empire to Constantinople itself and the despoti of the Morea in southern Greece. He built fortresses that commanded the Bosphorus, threatening to cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea trade that provided much of her remaining revenue. Each year brought new Ottoman encroachments, new demonstrations of power that the Byzantines could not resist. Emperor John VIII Palaeologos, who succeeded his father, Manuel II, in 1425, made one final attempt to secure Western help. He traveled to Italy in 1437 for a great council of the churches, where Orthodox and Catholic theologians would attempt to heal the schism that had divided Christendom for 4 centuries. After months of debate at Ferrara and Florence, an agreement was reached. The Orthodox Church would accept papal supremacy and Catholic theological positions in exchange for Western military aid against the Ottomans. John returned to Constantinople, bearing a document that promised salvation from the Turkish threat. The Union of Florence proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The Byzantine population rejected it almost unanimously, viewing the agreement as a betrayal of Orthodox faith for political advantage. The Grand Duke Lucas Notaras reportedly declared that he would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre, and his sentiment was widely shared. Riots greeted the attempts to implement the union, and the clergy who had signed the agreement at Florence repudiated it when they returned home. The emperor found himself isolated, committed to a policy that his own people despised. The Western aid that the Union was supposed to guarantee never materialized on the scale required. A crusade was organized in 1444, and an army of Hungarians, Poles, and other Central Europeans marched toward Ottoman territory with high hopes. At Varna, on the Black Sea coast, they met Murad II's forces and were annihilated. The King of Hungary died on the field, and with him died the last realistic hope of Western military intervention. Constantinople would have to face the Ottomans alone. Murad II died in 1451, and the throne passed to his son Mehmed, who was only 19 years old. Some in Constantinople hoped that the young sultan would prove weak or distracted, that the succession might trigger another Ottoman civil war, that somehow the pattern of narrow escapes would continue. They did not understand the nature of the man who now ruled in Edirne. From his earliest youth, Mehmed had been obsessed with Constantinople, with the glory of conquering the city that had defied Islam for 800 years, with the destiny that he believed awaited him behind those legendary walls. The new sultan began his preparations almost immediately. He built a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an older Ottoman fortification on the Asian side, together commanding the narrowest point of the strait. This castle, Rumeli Hisari, took only 4 months to construct, a demonstration of Ottoman organizational capacity that terrified the Byzantines who watched it rise. Any ship attempting to pass through the Bosphorus without Ottoman permission would now face bombardment from both shores. Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea had been cut. Inside the ancient capital, Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos knew that the final crisis had arrived. He had come to the throne in 1449, the last of a dynasty that stretched back to the 11th century, and he had no illusions about his chances. He sent desperate appeals to the West, promising to implement the Union of Florence, begging for ships and soldiers and money. The responses were sympathetic, but inadequate. A few hundred volunteers trickled in, along with a small Genoese contingent and some Phoenician ships that happened to be in the harbor. Against the vast host that Mehmed was assembling, it would not be nearly enough. The winter of 1452 to 1453 passed in feverish preparation on both sides. Mehmed gathered an army that may have numbered over 100,000 men, along with a fleet of more than 100 ships and an artillery train featuring the largest cannons the world had ever seen. Constantine scraped together fewer than 10,000 defenders, including armed civilians and foreign volunteers, to man walls that required 10 times that number. The mathematics of the coming siege were brutally simple. Constantinople had survived against long odds many times before, but the odds had never been this long, and the enemy had never been this determined. Spring came, and with it came the Ottoman host. On April 6, 1453, the siege of Constantinople began. The final act in a drama that had been building for 50 years, and that would decide whether the city of Constantine would remain Christian or become Muslim, whether the last remnant of the Roman Empire would endure or pass into history. The walls that had held for 1,000 years would face their ultimate test, and this time there would be no miracle, no Timur arriving from the east to scatter the besiegers, no distraction to draw the sultan away. This time, one way or another, the matter would be settled forever. The Ottoman army that assembled outside Constantinople in the spring of 1453 was the largest and best equipped force that had ever threatened the city. Mehmed II had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, gathering soldiers from every corner of his empire, stockpiling supplies sufficient for a prolonged siege, and assembling an arsenal of weapons that included innovations never before seen in warfare. The young sultan had staked everything on this campaign. Success would make him the greatest conqueror in Islamic history. Failure would likely cost him his throne and possibly his life. The centerpiece of Mehmed's preparations was his artillery. Cannons had existed for over a century, but they had never been deployed on the scale or with the power that Mehmed now commanded. His master gunsmith, a Hungarian engineer named Orban, had cast enormous bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton. The largest of these monsters, nicknamed the Basilica, required 60 oxen and 200 men to transport, and could fire only 7 times per day because of the time needed to cool and reload. But when it fired, the impact could shatter walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The defenders who manned those walls numbered fewer than 7,000, including perhaps 2,000 foreign volunteers who had answered Constantinople's desperate appeals. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Justiniani, had arrived with 700 professional soldiers and assumed command of the land defenses with the emperor's blessing. Venetian sailors manned the ships in the Golden Horn, and scattered contingents from other Italian states, from Catalonia and from as far as Scotland, had made their way to the doomed city, against the Ottoman host of perhaps 80,000, supplemented by thousands of irregular troops and camp followers. These defenders would attempt to hold walls stretching over 12 miles. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos knew that his chances were slim, but he was determined to fight rather than surrender. He had rejected Mehmed's offers of safe passage in exchange for yielding the city, reportedly declaring that it was not his to give. The decision was not merely personal honor, but a recognition that surrender would mean the end of everything Constantinople represented. As long as the walls held and the emperor reigned within them, the Roman Empire endured. To surrender was to acknowledge that the empire had truly died. The siege began on April 6, 1453, with Ottoman forces taking up positions along the entire length of the land walls. Mehmed established his headquarters opposite the weakest section of the fortifications, the Mesetikian in the Lycus Valley, where the walls dipped to cross a small stream and the ground favored the attackers. Here he concentrated his heaviest artillery, including the Great Basilica, and here he would direct the main assault when the moment came. Other batteries were positioned along the length of the walls, maintaining constant pressure and preventing the defenders from concentrating their limited forces. The bombardment began immediately and continued almost without pause for the next 7 weeks, day after day. The great guns hurled their stone projectiles against walls that had never been designed to withstand such punishment. The Theodosian fortifications, built 1,000 years earlier, had been engineered to resist battering rams and siege towers, not exploding gunpowder and half-toned cannonballs. Sections of wall crumbled under the relentless pounding. Towers collapsed. Gaps opened that the defenders struggled frantically to repair each night. The Byzantines and their allies worked through the darkness, filling the breaches with timber and earth, rubble and barrels. Anything that might absorb the impact of the next day's bombardment. Women and children joined the labor, carrying materials to the walls while soldiers stood guard against night attacks. By morning, the gaps would be closed, at least partially, and the cycle would begin again. It was exhausting, demoralizing work, and everyone knew it could not continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, the guns would create a breach faster than the defenders could repair it, and Mehmed attempted to break the stalemate through other means. His fleet, over 100 vessels strong, blockaded the sea approaches to Constantinople, but the chain across the Golden Horn and the skill of the Christian sailors kept the harbor secure. On April 20th, a small relief squadron of 4 ships, 3 Genoese transports, and 1 Byzantine vessel fought their way through the Ottoman blockade in a battle that the Sultan watched from the shore in helpless fury. The arrival of these ships lifted the defenders' spirits, but could not change the fundamental mathematics of the siege. The Sultan's response to this humiliation was characteristically bold. If his ships could not break through the chain, they would go around it. He ordered the construction of a wooden roadway over the hills behind Galata, a Genoese colony on the northern shore of the Golden Horn. On the night of April 22nd, Ottoman sailors dragged some 70 ships overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain entirely and launching them into the Golden Horn from the landward side. The defenders awoke to find enemy vessels in waters they had believed secure, threatening their inner harbor and stretching their already inadequate forces even thinner. A desperate attempt to destroy the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn failed when the attack was betrayed to the Sultan. The captured Christian sailors were executed within sight of the walls, and Mehmed had his Ottoman prisoners shot toward the city from his cannons. A grim message about the fate that awaited those who resisted. The psychological pressure on the defenders intensified with each passing day. As supplies dwindled, exhaustion accumulated, and hope faded. Yet, the walls held. Week after week, assault after assault was repulsed by defenders who fought with the courage of desperation. Justinian proved a brilliant tactician, appearing wherever the danger was greatest, rallying his men, plugging gaps in the defenses with improvised solutions. The emperor himself fought in the front lines, sharing the dangers of his soldiers and inspiring them by his example. Ottoman casualties mounted into the thousands, and murmurs of discontent began to spread through Mehmed's camp. His viziers urged him to lift the siege before the army's morale collapsed entirely. Mehmed refused to contemplate failure. He ordered a final assault, throwing everything he had against the exhausted defenders in one overwhelming push. The attack would begin in the early hours of May 29th, striking the walls at multiple points simultaneously, but concentrating the main effort against the battered Mezatikian. 3 waves of attackers would assault the breaches in succession, each fresh wave replacing the one before, giving the defenders no respite until they broke. The night of May 28th was given over to preparation and prayer on both sides. In the Ottoman camp, bonfires blazed and soldiers performed their devotions, preparing their souls for the battle that would bring either paradise or victory. Inside the city, the churches filled for what many sensed would be their final services. Orthodox and Catholic worshipped together in Hagia Sophia, the theological disputes that had divided them set aside in the face of common doom. Emperor Constantine received communion and asked forgiveness from all whom he might have wronged, the traditional preparation for death. The assault began in the small hours of May 29th, announced by the thunder of drums and the screams of attacking infantry. The first wave consisted of irregulars, poorly armed auxiliaries, whose purpose was to exhaust the defenders before the better troops engaged. They hurled themselves at the walls and died in heaps, but they accomplished their purpose. When they finally fell back, having achieved nothing but the depletion of Byzantine arrows and energy, the second wave advanced. These were the Anatolian regulars, disciplined soldiers who attacked with more skill and determination than the irregulars had shown. For 2 hours, they pressed the assault, probing for weaknesses, seeking to exploit any gap in the defenses. The fighting was savage, hand to hand, along the makeshift barricades that blocked the breaches. But still, the defenders held. Mehmed committed his reserves, sending in fresh troops to maintain the pressure, but Justiniani's men refused to break. Then disaster struck. Justiniani was wounded, a crossbow bolt or arquebus ball piercing his armor and striking him in the chest or arm. Accounts vary on the details, but the result was catastrophic. The Genoese commander demanded to be taken from the walls for treatment, and despite Constantine's pleas that he remain at his post, he was carried through a gate in the inner wall to the supposed safety of the city. His men, seeing their leader depart, began to waver. The defense that had held firm for hours suddenly showed cracks. Mehmed saw the moment and unleashed his final reserve, the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who formed the core of Ottoman military power. These were the finest infantry in the world, disciplined, fanatical, and fresh. They struck the weakened defenses like a hammer, pouring through gaps that exhausted defenders could no longer plug. At almost the same moment, a small group of Ottomans discovered that a small gate in the walls, the Kirka Porta, had been left open after a sortie. They rushed through, raising Ottoman banners on the inner wall. The defense collapsed with terrifying speed. Soldiers who had fought heroically for hours lost heart when they saw enemy banners behind them and heard that the walls had been breached elsewhere. The organized resistance dissolved into desperate flight, men scrambling to reach the harbor and the ships that might carry them to safety. The Janissaries surged forward, cutting down all who stood before them. Emperor Constantine XI died somewhere in the chaos of those final moments. No one who survived could say exactly how or where he fell. Some accounts have him charging into the Ottoman ranks when he saw that all was lost, seeking death rather than capture. Others say he was cut down while defending a gate or trampled in the press of fleeing soldiers. His body was never positively identified, though Mehmed reportedly found a corpse wearing imperial regalia and had the head displayed as proof of victory. The last emperor of the Romans vanished into the anonymity of mass death, his end as obscure as the empire he had failed to save. The Ottoman soldiers poured into the city, and the sack that followed erased forever the Constantinople that had existed since Constantine's day. The 3 days of licensed pillage that Mehmed had promised his troops claimed thousands of lives and destroyed or dispersed treasures that had survived 1,000 years. Hagia Sophia was filled with refugees who hoped that the sacred space might protect them. It did not. The soldiers burst through the doors and seized everyone inside, carrying them off to slavery, regardless of age or station. When Mehmed finally entered the city on the afternoon of May 29th, he rode directly to Hagia Sophia. He found a soldier hacking at the marble pavement and struck him with his sword, declaring that he had given his men the people and the movable wealth, but that the buildings belonged to him. He ordered the church converted into a mosque, and an imam ascended the pulpit to proclaim the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, in the space where patriarchs had celebrated the Christian liturgy for 9 centuries. The Sultan walked through his conquered city in something like wonder. He saw the ruined palaces and the empty streets, the churches stripped of their ornaments and the houses filled with corpses. According to later accounts, he murmured verses from a Persian poet about the transience of earthly glory. The city that had defied his ancestors, the prize that had haunted Muslim dreams for 800 years, was his. But it was also a ruin, its population dead or enslaved, its wealth scattered, its spirit broken. Constantinople had fallen. The Roman Empire, which had endured in one form or another for nearly 2,000 years, had finally ended. The echoes of that ending would reverberate through centuries, shaping the identities of nations not yet born and fueling conflicts not yet imagined. But in the smoke and silence of May 29th, 1453, there was only the reality of conquest, the weeping of captives, and the prayers of the victors giving thanks for what their swords had won. The conqueror entered his prize on the afternoon of May 29th, 1453, riding through the shattered gates on horseback, while the bodies of the fallen still lay where they had dropped. Mehmed too was 21 years old, and he had achieved what generations of Muslim commanders had attempted and failed. The city that had defied the armies of Islam for 8 centuries, the legendary red apple of Turkish folklore, was his. He rode directly to Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, and there he performed the afternoon prayer, claiming the building for Islam. The Byzantine Empire had ended, and something new was about to begin. The first days after the conquest were given over to the traditional 3 days of pillage that Mehmed had promised his troops. Soldiers roamed the streets, taking whatever they could carry, enslaving thousands of Greeks who had failed to escape or find sanctuary. Churches were stripped of their treasures, houses ransacked, warehouses emptied. The violence was extensive, but not unlimited. Mehmed had no intention of ruling over a wasteland, and he intervened to stop the destruction before it consumed everything of value. When the 3 days ended, he imposed order with an iron hand, executing soldiers who continued to plunder and establishing the framework of Ottoman administration. Mehmed's vision for Constantinople was not destruction, but transformation. He saw himself as the heir of the Roman Caesars, the legitimate successor to the empire he had conquered, and he intended his capital to reflect that imperial dignity. The city would not be razed, but rebuilt, not abandoned, but repopulated, not forgotten, but elevated to even greater glory under Ottoman rule. He took for himself the title Kaiser-i-Ram, Caesar of Rome, a claim that horrified Christian Europe, but that expressed his sincere understanding of what he had inherited. The immediate challenge was demographic. The siege and sack had scattered Constantinople's already diminished population, and the Sultan needed people to fill the empty spaces within those vast walls. He issued orders throughout his empire commanding the resettlement of Constantinople, bringing in Turkish Muslims from Anatolia, Greeks from the Aegean Islands, Armenians from the east, Jews expelled from Spain and other European kingdoms. The new Istanbul, as the Turks called it, derived from the Greek phrase Is, ten, Poland, meaning to the city would be a cosmopolitan metropolis from its very refounding. Mehmed proved surprisingly tolerant of his Christian subjects, at least by the standards of the age. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadios Scholarios, and granted the church considerable autonomy in governing the Christian community. This was not charity, but pragmatism. The Greek population possessed skills and knowledge that the Ottoman state needed, and a functioning ecclesiastical hierarchy would keep them orderly and productive. The patriarch became responsible for civil as well as religious matters within the Christian community. It's a system that would persist for centuries and that preserved Orthodox Christianity within the Ottoman realm. The physical transformation of the city began almost immediately. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, her Christian mosaics plastered over, minarets rising at her corners, a mihrab indicating the direction of Mecca inserted into walls that had witnessed 1,000 years of Christian liturgy. But Mehmed did not simply Islamicize existing structures. He commissioned new buildings that would proclaim Ottoman power and piety, beginning a construction program that would continue under his successors for generations. The Fatim Mosque, the Mosque of the Conqueror, rose on the site of the Church of the Holy Apostles, where Byzantine emperors had been buried since the days of Constantine. This vast complex included not only the mosque itself, but also madrasas for religious education, a hospital, a caravanserai for travelers, and charitable institutions that served the poor. It established the pattern for Ottoman religious architecture. The great imperial mosques that would eventually dot the skyline of Istanbul and rival Hagia Sophia in their magnificence. Mehmed rebuilt the commercial infrastructure that had made Constantinople wealthy. The Grand Bazaar, the Kapali Karsi, began to take shape as a covered market where merchants from across the known world could trade their goods. He restored the harbor facilities, dredged the silted waterways, and encouraged trade by granting privileges to merchants of various nations. The Genoese colony at Galata, across the Golden Horn, was permitted to remain, its residents becoming Ottoman subjects while retaining considerable autonomy. Venice and other Italian states negotiated trading agreements that allowed their merchants to operate within the empire, ensuring that Istanbul remained a hub of international commerce. The Topkapi Palace rose on the point of the peninsula where the Bosphorus met the Golden Horn, occupying the site that had once held Byzantine administrative buildings. This sprawling complex would serve as the seat of Ottoman government for 4 centuries, a city within a city where the Sultan lived in seclusion, surrounded by his harem, his guards, and the elaborate bureaucracy that administered an empire stretching across 3 continents. His palace was a statement of power, but also of a particular Ottoman approach to rulership, combining magnificence with mystery, accessibility to petitioners with impenetrable secrecy at the core. Mehmed died in 1481, having transformed Constantinople from a dying Byzantine relic into a thriving Ottoman capital. His successors continued the work he had begun, each sultan leaving his mark on the cityscape. Byzid built his own great mosque complex and expanded the palace. Selim I, the conqueror of Egypt, brought the treasures of the Mamluks to adorn Istanbul's buildings. And then came Suleiman, known to Europeans as the Magnificent, and to his own people as Kanuni, the lawgiver, under whose reign Istanbul reached heights of splendor that rivaled anything the Byzantine emperors had achieved. Suleiman's 46-year reign, from 1520 to 1566, represented the apogee of Ottoman power and the golden age of Istanbul. The empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, from Morocco to Persia, and the wealth of 3 continents flowed through the capital. Suleiman was not only a conqueror, but a patron of arts and architecture, and he found in the architect Sinan a genius capable of realizing his ambitions in stone. Sinan, born a Christian in Anatolia and recruited through the Devshirme system that staffed Ottoman armies and bureaucracies, became the greatest architect the Islamic world has ever produced. Over a career spanning 50 years, he designed hundreds of buildings, but his masterpieces rose in Istanbul. The Sizad Mosque, built in memory of Suleiman's beloved son, who died young. The Suleimani Mosque, crowning one of Istanbul's hills, a symphony in stone that many consider the finest Ottoman building ever constructed. The dome of the Suleimani deliberately echoed Hagia Sophia, Sinan's acknowledgement of the Byzantine achievement and his determination to surpass it. Under Suleiman, Istanbul became a city of perhaps 500,000 people, matching or exceeding the population that Constantinople had reached at her Byzantine peak. The skyline bristled with minarets and domes. The markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world, and the streets teemed with a diversity of peoples unmatched anywhere on earth. Turks and Greeks, Armenians and Jews, Arabs and Persians, Africans and Europeans jostled in the bazaars, worshipped in their respective houses of prayer, and contributed their varied talents to the life of the imperial capital. The centuries that followed brought decline as well as splendor, periods of weakness interspersed with moments of revival. The Ottoman Empire gradually lost ground to rising European powers, surrendering territories that it once seemed secure, watching helplessly as the balance of power shifted toward the west. But Istanbul endured, adapting to each new era while preserving the accumulated heritage of millennia. The tulip era of the early 18th century brought European influences into Ottoman art and architecture. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century attempted to modernize the empire along European lines. Through it all, the city remained the capital, the seat of the Sultan Caliph, who claimed authority over Muslims worldwide. The First World War brought the Ottoman Empire to its end, defeated and occupied, stripped of its Arab provinces and its European territories. The empire gave way to the Turkish Republic, proclaimed by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1923. The capital moved to Ankara, a deliberate break with the imperial past, and Istanbul lost the political centrality it had enjoyed since Constantine's day. Caliphate was abolished, the last sultan sent into exile, and a new Turkey set about transforming itself into a modern nation-state. Istanbul survived this transformation as she had survived so many others. The city that had been Byzantium, Constantinople, and Istanbul remained the largest and most important urban center in Turkey, even if Ankara held the government. Her population continued to grow, swelling from 1 million in the early 20th century to 15 million and beyond in the 21st. The ancient walls, no longer needed for defense, became historical monuments, the great mosques still called the faithful to prayer. While the churches that had survived Ottoman rule continued to serve diminished but persistent Christian communities. The layers of history lie everywhere visible for those who know how to look. Beneath the streets run Byzantine cisterns, their columns reflected in dark waters, engineering marvels that still function after 1,500 years. The Theodosian walls still march across the peninsula, battered by time and traffic, but still standing, still defining the boundary between the ancient city and its modern suburbs. Hagia Sophia, which has served as church, mosque, museum, and mosque again, still lifts her dome above the Bosphorus, embodying in a single building the transformations that this place has witnessed. The Golden Horn still curves inland from the Bosphorus, still providing the natural harbor that first drew Greek colonists to this site nearly 3,000 years ago. Strait still flows between two continents, carrying the traffic of nations as it has since before recorded history. The geography that made this location unique remains unchanged, even as the human constructions that exploit it have risen and fallen and risen again. To walk the streets of Istanbul today is to walk through time itself. Here, Constantine proclaimed his new Rome and dedicated it to Christ. Here, Justinian built his church of holy wisdom and watched it rise from the ashes of riot. Here, the Crusaders broke through the sea walls and perpetrated their terrible sack. Here, the last Constantine died defending his city against the armies of Mehmed. Here, Suleiman the Magnificent held court, while Sinan raised domes that still inspire wonder. Every stone carries memories, every vista recalls vanished empires, every breath draws in air that emperors and sultans once breathed. The city has been Greek and Roman, Christian and Muslim, Byzantine and Ottoman, imperial capital and republican metropolis. It has been besieged by Persians and Arabs, Crusaders and Turks. It has been sacked and burned, built and restored, abandoned and repopulated. Through every transformation, something essential has persisted, some quality of place that makes this narrow strip of land between two seas irreplaceable in the human imagination. They called it the city of world's desire, and desire still draws millions to her shores each year. Tourists crowd the courtyards of the Blue Mosque and the chambers of Topkapi Palace. Scholars study the manuscripts that survived the centuries in her libraries. Pilgrims seek out the shrines of saints, Christian and Muslim alike. Merchants still trade in the Grand Bazaar, as merchants have traded on this spot since before the Ottomans, before the Byzantines, before any of the empires that claimed this place as their own. The sun sets over the Golden Horn, painting the domes and minarets in shades of amber and rose. The call to prayer echoes from 1,000 mosques, as it has echoed for nearly 600 years. Somewhere, a church bell rings, as church bells have rung for nearly 2,000 years. The ferries cross the Bosphorus carrying commuters between continents, following routes that fishing boats have traveled since the age of Byzas. The city endures, as she has always endured, bridging worlds, outlasting empires, eternal at the place where East meets West. And now, as sleep draws near, and the sounds of the ancient city fade into the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, let the story settle into dreams. Let the walls and domes drift into the distance. The emperors and sultans take their rest. The centuries fold gently into one another. The city will be there when morning comes, as she has been there through all the mornings since Byzas first saw this shore and knew he had found his home. Constantinople, Istanbul, the city of world's desire, watches over those who sleep within her memory and waits, as she has always waited, for whatever tomorrow may bring.